we have to go to a fire 140 miles away.
Pretty neat, right?
Take pictures later on. So here we have a full-scale replica of the Avro Arrow. The Arrow was built in the late 50s as a Mach 2 Interceptor. This model was built starting in 1997, and its first rollout was in 2006. It was built by a whole bunch of volunteers at Downsview there. That's where the Avro Aerospace Museum got its start. So other than a load of de Havilland stuff that they inherited from de Havilland at Downsview, they decided to build this model. I think a lot of the volunteers had seen the Avro Arrow movie, the CBC miniseries, and decided they could do something much better. So they wanted something that would externally represent the Arrow as they remembered it, because they were ex-Avro employees, most of them. So it was kind of therapy for them, closing the circle, because they had been terminated so very suddenly, and they had nothing else to show for it. So they got together, we re-engineered this thing. The dimensions are exact to what the Avro Arrow, or what they remember it as, because they had to do without drawings and design information, because that had been all destroyed. So they had to rely on books and photograph of the Avro Arrow. So it's 80 feet long, 50 feet wide at the wingtips, and 21 feet high at the tip of the tail. The only difference between the Avro Arrow and this model is that this weighs 14,000 pounds. The Arrow itself weighed 40,000 pounds empty. Also, this doesn't have an engine in it, of course, any engines. But all the equipment also is missing from it. The radar, the air conditioning equipment, everything else, and fuel, of course. So, why did they choose 203 among all the 5 aircraft that flew of the Arrow? Why did they choose 203? Well, it was because of several things that stuck in their minds about the accomplishments of the particular 203 Avro Arrow. One is that it was the first aircraft to have the high visibility markings on it, the orange parts. This was put on all the Arrows eventually in the winter of 1958-59. The chase aircraft had trouble picking out this all-white aircraft from the ground scatter of all the snow on the ground. So that's why they put the orange markings on it. It was also the first and only Arrow to carry the red ensign on the tail. The red ensign was our national flag at the time, and they wanted to put that on there to show that this was an all-Canadian aircraft built by Canadians for Canadians. 203 was also the first and last Arrow to fly with 2 people on board. On February 19th, Spud Pataki took off with Red Darrow, who was the engineer tweaking the fly-by-wire system on it. And it was the last aircraft that Jan Zurkowski flew as well. Jan Zurkowski was the chief test pilot at Avro at the time. He retired in September of 1958, and this was the last Arrow that he flew. He then moved to Barry's Beach, set up a hunting and fishing launch. I think that was the last aircraft he flew as well. But he'd had a very distinguished career in the Polish Air Force and also in Britain during the Battle of Britain, and test aircraft in Britain as well. During the building of this model, it was also, as well as the labor was donated, most of the materials were also donated by various companies around the Toronto area. The aluminum skinning was donated by Alcan Canada. The landing gear was donated by Messier Dowdy, who built the original landing gear for the Arrow. The paint job was donated by Bombardier there at Downsview. So in between them painting their business jets, they managed to fit this in and painted the whole thing. And all the interior of this structure is all square tubing, holding everything together. The square tubing was also donated by Avro Textron in Rexdale there. And all the rivets involved in pinning the skin to the structure, there was 120,000 of them, was also donated by company. So during the building of this model, it was very much supported by dignitaries and luminaries of the Arrow days. One of them was David Onley, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario at that time. Various mayors of Toronto. I think John Tory and somebody else was also very supportive, as well as two Avroites, James Floyd and Jan Zurikowski. So James Floyd was credited with putting in the last rivet into this model, and they have that commemorated with a plaque on the front landing gear. But what about the Arrow itself, where this came from? Turn that over to Dennis here, and he'll give you all the history of that.
You saw the MiG-15 over there, and the MiG-15 was very revolutionary because it was the first time that military aircraft was being powered by jet engines. And in particular, in the Korean War, the Russians were supplying North Korea with these MiG-15s. The Americans came back with a lot of their propeller aircraft from World War II, and they were getting shot down very easily by the MiGs until they came back with an F-86. So there was a threat from Russia. And has anybody seen Oppenheimer, the movie Oppenheimer here? Oh, you've seen you notice in the movie, the threat of Russia was always there. There's no question during the movie. And in 1949, something happened in 1949 where Russia dropped their atomic bomb. And that put even more impetus in it. So we had the Korean War. Then there was threats about the threat of Russians developing their long-range bombers coming across the pole type of area. So what happened here was RCF, with cooperation with the states, put together a specification called 7-3. And that was actually put out in 53. And as we were sitting over on it, it was for a two-seated pilot, navigator back there. It would achieve Mach 2. Mach 2, just an idea of Mach 2. Mach 2 wasn't even made by the Americans yet until later on in that year by one of the derivatives of the X-15. So Mach 2 wasn't even in the viewpoint of a lot of Americans. They sent out the specification, so it was going to be high-speed aircraft, two-seater, and they went out and went to various manufacturers. One was Boeing, went to Hawker Siddeley, they went to Bell at that time, and nobody wanted to do it. They were asking for the moon. So Avro, the average age of Avro at the time was the average age of maybe you guys, 28 type of thing, okay, in that range there. They'd put up their hands and said, guess what, we'll do it. We're going to go ahead and do that. Now they had some background experience with some other aircraft previous to that, but they were quite far ahead with their jet engine technology for aircraft. So they picked up the RCF team and said, go ahead and we've given you approval to start building 36 aircraft. Well, they haven't designed it yet, but they were given the approval to go ahead with it. And what they did was adopt a new manufacturing process called the Cook-Craiglee manufacturing process. What that is to cut down the lead time to build aircraft. What we do is to start building. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The first 5 are going to be their test aircraft. So with that type of structure put in place here, they have to do a lot of testing. There's no question, because if you're building aircraft, you've got to do a lot of testing. So one of the testing was, see this model here? This model here, think of a model with 1.5 times larger than that. They took them on Nike rockets. They actually built 11 of them, flew them in Lake Ontario to get what we call flight derivatives. How is the aircraft going to behave itself at high speeds type of thing here? Because Canada at that time didn't have any high-speed tunnels. So what do? The Americans are there. Guess what? They have high-speed tunnels. So they went down to Cornell University. They went to Langley in Virginia, and they did a lot of groundwork as far as high-speed testing of aircraft. And there's a couple things that certainly came out of it. First of all, see that dog tooth there? You see it up there? Right there. For the guys who are pilots or aeroground, what they found with flights, the vortices over the wing come like this here. And they lose lift as they go up in speed. So by putting a fence on it, nowadays a lot of aircraft have air fences on, but they actually put a dog tooth on by Chamberlain, who was the chief aircraft analyst. They also found that the camber, that's a very thin wing. When you look at the aircraft out here, it's thinner than most aircraft out here. And see how thin that wing is? They found it with their studies with the high-speed tunnels that on thick wings, you had shock waves here, 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 and here. On a very thin wing like that, you had a shock wave here and here. And what does shock waves do? Shock waves are big drag eaters. And aircraft engines do not like lots of drag by any chance. So they developed this very thin camber wing section. They also came up with the delta wing, very similar to the swept-back that we saw in the MiG. Up here, they even came up with, as they were going through their testing procedure, and some of you will know about air that's very close to the surface of the ground. When you stick your hand out your window on your car, you feel that air coming through here? Well, as you go up into supersonic speeds, what happens here? The air, is called the boundary layer, actually starts increasing itself and sucks into the intake and chokes the intake. Also, there's a shock wave that's developed right in here. So that actually prevents a lot of the air intake. So what did they do? The designers came up with new technology, and they put a knife in here, and behind the knife is a suction blower. They suck in air, and they had 20 tons of air conditioning that they were using, because at that time they were using analog computers, and some of you may know what vacuum tubes are. Some of you may. The guys back there won't know what vacuum tubes are, I'm sure. But they were before transistors, those type of things here. But these vacuum tubes were energy gobblers, so they had to cool all that down. They were using analog computers at the same time. They also came up with air brakes. First time air brakes on today's aircraft, as you know, you use spoilers type of thing to slow it down. And it slowed down the aircraft from landing speed from about 220 knots down to 180 knots. Those also came up with what we call the aerial rule. See the aerial rule? The aerial rule is what they used in the design of aircraft so as to give the shape of a Coke bottle. And what that does here is actually allows slower or less drag on it, and also they get contribution of lift from the fuselage as compared to wings. So a lot of technology that they were going into building this aircraft for the first time. So they got the aircraft underway. They started to build the aircraft. Well, you need an engine. Well, Rolls-Royce was going to supply them with an engine, an RB206 engine type of thing here. RBH, or Rolls-Royce, I should say. Rolls-Royce, 2 years later, said, guess what? We can't supply you with an engine. So what do? In the meantime, they had determined what they need as far as the jet engine requirements are, but they went to a Pratt & Whitney J75. J75 with afterburners on it was about 23,000 pounds of thrust. And that's what they were using for the first test aircraft here. But parallel to that, they said, that's not going to be enough for us. We want to go to 30,000 pounds of thrust. And we're back about the weight of the aircraft with fuel was about 33,000 pounds. With jet engines that they wanted 30,000 pounds each. That was 60,000 pounds. So it was the first aircraft that had a weight to thrust ratio of 1-to-1. At that particular time, it was unheard of at that particular time. So they went to, under the umbrella of Avro, they had a number of companies, and Arenda was one of them. Arenda had been building jet engines for a while, and they decided that they're going to supply this 30,000 pound Aerocolumn 13 with the afterburner thrust here. And here's a model of it down here. And they were pretty smart guys too. They actually came up with new materials. They were using titanium for the first time. And when it comes to jet engines, the biggest problem with jet engines is the turbine, is materials for turbines. They came up with titanium type of turbines. They were using on the afterburner. I don't know if many of you, probably a lot of you, have tried to start a snowblower in January. You know, the old hand ones where I have this hand one. Well, it's hard to start up, so what do I use? I use a little bit of ether or quick start. I put that in there and it starts up on me. Well, what did they do? At 50,000 feet, the temperature is minus 56 degrees. What do? They put a ring on the afterburner that has pure oxygen in it, and that allowed them to start up the afterburner. They also did a whole bunch of other smart things on it. They had on the intake, they actually put a variable nozzle, and on the exhaust as well. And you know, you have a garden hose at home. Garden hose at home has that variable nozzle on it. They actually incorporated that into the afterburner at the same time. So alongside of the airframe is being built, the engine is now being built by Arenda, and they actually put 7,600 hours on it, and it was so successful that the French government wanted to buy 300 of them for the Mirage jets. So that's moving right along. So they got the aircraft, they got the engine over here. Now, because it's a military fighter, you got to have some sort of missile system on it. A little different than the MiG. You remember the MiG out there we saw? It has two 23mm cannons on it. And here's where the pilot is actually zooming on the target. Well, going at Mach 2, you go down to Toronto and back in about 3 or 4 minutes type of thing. They had, in here, they had a dome right there, a radar dome that could see 50 miles away. 50 miles away, going at those type of speeds, you're going to be there in about 2 minutes. Okay, so the pilot might be able to adjust his aircraft accordingly. Unfortunately, there's another hiccup here. The missile, and there's actually, in the bay itself here, one of the largest bays that they ever built, is bigger than a bomber bay. It has 8 missiles on it, 4 in the front and 4 in the back. But about the missile itself has a range of 5 miles. 5 miles, you're going to be there in about 8 seconds, 9 seconds. So a pilot cannot lock on the target. He has to have smart technology to fly the aircraft. And as you go up in supersonic speeds here, stability aircraft becomes very unstable at that time. So they need to have these onboard computers for the first time to be able to handle that type of changes that are happening. On the control surface here, and you have a pilot, a couple pilots here, they have the equivalent of 6 elephants standing on the elevators here. So as a result of that, you have to have some means to be able to control that. So what they did, they put hydraulics in for the first time. They were using special hydraulics that they actually designed and built for that particular application. But that's what I call the low level. You've got to control the hydraulics. And this is where the computer and the pilot comes into it. The computers are actually trimming the aircraft. And their pilot aircraft that were running beside them in the test run for Jennifer Railscape, they were fine. They were radioing over to the test pilot and said, your surfaces are moving. He said, I'm not touching them. The computer's taking over. So we're talking about 50s, using analog computers back in the 50s. So why did they need? They needed that type of information to be able to lock on targets. So that was the technology, not just the development of the airframe. They were going into the missile system. The original specification that they had was going to be, they were going to buy off-the-shelf used missile systems. That sounded pretty good at the time, except for the Americans came back and said, guess what, Canada, you should design and build your own. Well, so they gave contracts to some Canadian suppliers. Canadian suppliers came back, and after doing some work here, they came back to the government and said, well, we need about $120 million more to be able to do this. So alongside, so you got the missile system actually being developed, you got the engine being developed, and you got the airframe being developed. So back in December of 57, just like this hangar here, we got the aircraft ready to roll out. The doors go up here, big military are out here, the public are out here watching the rollout of this aircraft. Well, something else happened on that same day, way up there in space. Sputnik. Sputnik came. So prior to Sputnik, there was some sort of hesitation happening in the governments now about, are we into missile technology rather than interceptors? So there was a question mark that had been developed prior to this period of time. Nevertheless, on March the 25th, 1958, after only 5 years from designing an aircraft, they had their first flight. By James Krowski, it was about 33.5-minute flight that they had. On that flight, he broke 4 world records on that first flight. On his 4th flight, he achieved Mach 1. Mach 1, he got it, not like most aircraft or all aircraft at the time going down, he got it going up. So a lot of development was going on at that particular time, and the development that they were doing to keep that momentum going that they had here. Well, in the meantime, costs are starting to rise. The Americans are saying, well, we know what your technology is, but Eisenhower was talking to Diefenbaker and says, guess what? If you stop your program, we will supply you with some auxiliary equipment. Well, Diefenbaker got moved into office there, and what his job was to cut down costs. The military, with the RCF in particular, were getting raked through the coals, I'd put it that way, by the Army and the Navy. Said, where's my money for my ships, for my other types of equipment? So there was pressure on the RCF about what they're going to do with costs. Costs are starting to increase. The Americans are supplying, guess what? We have an alternative for you. If you stop down the program, we can actually supply you with that. So back on February the 20th, 1959, obviously the announcement was made in the government that we're shutting down the Arrow program. Along with that, the rented engines, remember we were talking about, we were going to sell them to France as well, 3 out of them. That was shut down too. So all the technologies at that particular time were shut down. The announcement came through the office or the manufacturing facility saying is that put down your tools and go home. Well, 15,000 employees between Avro and Arenda went home that day. 9,000 with Avro, another 6,000 with Arenda. So major disaster for what had happened. And in the meantime, the Americans were supplying, well, part of that decision-making process was that Americans were going to supply Bomark missiles to Canada. Well, a couple things with Bomark. Because Canada was tied into the Americans said, well, basically, if you don't take our Bomark missiles, we're going to put them in Buffalo. And if they're used, all the fallout is going to be here in Toronto, Hamilton, and Southern Ontario. So obviously, it was a force of hand to make sure that Bomark missiles came to Canada. One problem with Bomark missiles was this. Their guidance systems to lock on a target were fully developed. So what did they use? They used nuclear warheads. And the reason for nuclear warheads is because, well, you're going to get that aircraft, you're going to get everything around it for 20 miles type of thing as well. So that was the technology that they were using at the time for Bomark missiles. Later on, the government actually closed down that, and the Americans came back and said, well, we're going to give you, or we'll sell you, never give me, but sell you Voodoo jets. So that's what they did. They bought 100 Voodoo jets, and almost for the price of, by the time you got the Bomarks, the systems behind the Bomark system, and it was almost equivalent to what they had already spent on the aircraft itself and the development work.